In the morning, July 1985, Elizabeth Taylor's phone rings. It's Rock Hudson, and he's about to tell her something that will change her life, and the lives of millions, forever. This is the story of a phone call, and a promise, and how Elizabeth Taylor became the woman who changed the world. The phone rang at 3 in the morning. Elizabeth Taylor woke up, reached for it in the dark, knocked over a glass of water. The voice on the other end was familiar. Weak, but familiar. Rock Hudson. Elizabeth sat up immediately. Because Rock never called at 3 in the morning. Rock was in Paris. Filming. He'd been there for weeks. Elizabeth turned on the lamp. Her heart was already racing. Rock's voice sounded wrong. Thin. Tired. Like he'd been crying. And then he said the words that would change everything. He was dying. AIDS. 6 months. Maybe less. Elizabeth stopped breathing. Wait. It gets worse. Rock told Elizabeth he'd known for a year. A whole year. And he hadn't told anyone. Not his agent. Not his publicist. Not the studio. Nobody. Because in 1985, AIDS was a death sentence. But more than that, it was a scandal. A shame. A secret you took to your grave. Rock Hudson was one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. America's leading man. The handsome hero. The romantic icon. Every woman in America had been in love with Rock Hudson at some point. He'd starred in dozens of romantic comedies. Always got the girl. Always played the perfect gentleman. He'd been in Hollywood for 35 years. Since 1948. Started as Roy Fitzgerald, a truck driver from Illinois with a nice smile and big dreams. The studios changed his name to Rock Hudson. Taught him how to walk, how to talk, how to be a movie star. And Rock became exactly what they wanted. The all-American hero. Strong, masculine, reliable. But it was all a lie. Rock was gay. He'd known since he was a teenager. And he'd spent his entire adult life hiding it. In the 1950s and 60s, being gay in Hollywood meant the end of your career. Studios had morality clauses in contracts. If you were exposed as homosexual, you were fired, blacklisted, destroyed. So Rock lived 2 lives. In public, he dated beautiful women. Even got married once, to his agent's secretary. The marriage lasted 3 years. It was a business arrangement. Everyone in Hollywood knew it. In private, Rock had relationships with men. Quietly, carefully, always terrified of being caught. And he'd gotten away with it. For decades. Until AIDS. If people knew Rock had AIDS, they'd know something else too. Something Rock had hidden his entire life. He was gay. Elizabeth already knew. She'd known for decades. Rock had told her years ago, late one night after too much wine. They'd been filming Giant together in 1956. Elizabeth was 24. Rock was 31. They became instant friends. Between takes, they'd talk for hours. About everything. Their families. Their fears. Their secrets. One night, after the wrap party, Rock had walked Elizabeth back to her trailer. And he'd told her the truth. He'd expected shock, judgment, rejection. Instead, Elizabeth had hugged him and said she didn't care who he loved, as long as he was happy. That night, Rock Hudson and Elizabeth Taylor became best friends. Real friends. The kind who knew each other's secrets and kept them. For the next 30 years, Rock was the person Elizabeth called when she needed to talk. When her marriages fell apart. When she felt alone. And Elizabeth was the person Rock trusted completely. The only one who knew the real him. But now Rock was dying. And he was alone in Paris. And he needed help. Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She asked Rock what he needed. Where he was. How bad it was. Rock's voice broke. He told Elizabeth he was in Paris because the American doctors had given up. Told him to go home and die. The American medical establishment barely acknowledged AIDS existed. The disease had been killing people since 1981. For years. And the government had done almost nothing. President Reagan hadn't even said the word AIDS publicly. Not once. Thousands of people were dying. Mostly gay men. And the world didn't care. But France had an experimental treatment. A doctor named Dominique Dormant who was trying something new. A drug called HPA-23. It was a last chance. A desperate hope. Rock had flown to Paris in secret. Used a fake name. Paid cash for everything. Told nobody where he was going. He'd checked into the American hospital in Paris under an assumed identity. started the experimental treatment. And for a few weeks, it seemed to work. Rock felt a little better, a little stronger. But then he got worse. Much worse. And now he was alone in a French hospital room, dying, with no one who knew him. No one who cared. Elizabeth made a decision in that moment. One of the most important decisions of her life. She told Rock she was coming to Paris. Tonight. Right now. Rock tried to argue. Told her not to. Said the press would find out. Said it would ruin everything. If Elizabeth Taylor flew to Paris to visit Rock Hudson in a hospital, people would ask questions. And if they found out Rock had AIDS, the scandal would destroy him. But Elizabeth didn't care. She hung up, packed a bag, called her assistant, booked a private jet, and 6 hours later, she was on a plane to France. And when Elizabeth walked into that hospital room, what she saw made her realize something terrible. Rock looked like a ghost. This man, this beautiful, strong, vibrant man Elizabeth had known for 30 years, looked like he'd aged 40 years in 6 months. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, his skin gray. He'd lost maybe 50 pounds. Maybe more. The muscle and vitality that had made Rock Hudson a movie star were gone. In their place was a frail, skeletal man who could barely sit up. Elizabeth walked to his bedside, took his hand, and tried not to cry. Because Rock had asked her not to cry. Years ago, he'd made her promise. They'd been filming together. Some romantic comedy in the early 60s. Elizabeth couldn't even remember which one. There had been so many. And between takes, Rock had said something that stuck with her forever. He'd said that when he died, whenever that was, however it happened, he didn't want people crying over him. He wanted them fighting. Fighting for the people who came after him. Fighting for the ones who didn't have money or fame or friends like Elizabeth Taylor. Fighting for justice. At the time, Elizabeth had laughed it off. Rock was in his 30s. Healthy. Strong. Death seemed impossibly far away. But now, sitting in that Paris hospital room 30 years later, Elizabeth understood. Rock was dying, and he wanted his death to mean something. Rock squeezed Elizabeth's hand. His grip was weak, but it was there. And he told her what he needed to tell her. What he'd been planning to tell her for weeks. He told Elizabeth he was going to die. Probably soon. The French treatment wasn't working. Dr. Dormant had told him there was nothing more they could do. Rock had maybe 3 months left. Maybe less. But before he died, Rock wanted to do something. Something brave. Something that terrified him more than dying. He wanted to tell the world the truth. Not just about the AIDS. About everything. About being gay. About living a lie for 40 years. About the double life. The secret relationships. The constant fear. Rock wanted to come out, publicly, as a dying man with AIDS. Elizabeth's first instinct was to protect him. To tell him no. To say he didn't have to do this. That he could keep his privacy. Die in peace. But Rock cut her off. He told Elizabeth this wasn't about him anymore. It was bigger than him. If Rock Hudson, America's leading man, the symbol of masculine perfection, could have AIDS, then anyone could have AIDS. And maybe, just maybe, people would finally start paying attention. Start caring. Start funding research. Start saving lives. Rock told Elizabeth about the other patients in the hospital. Young men, most of them, dying alone because their families had disowned them. Because society had abandoned them. Men who couldn't afford treatment. Who'd been fired from their jobs. Evicted from their homes. Cut off from everyone they loved. Men who were dying in the shadows because the world refused to acknowledge they existed. Rock wanted his death to pull AIDS out of the shadows. Force people to see it. Force them to care. Even if it meant destroying his own reputation. Even if it meant the world would know his secret. Elizabeth held Rock's hand tighter. And she made him a promise. She promised that when Rock died, she wouldn't let the world forget him. Wouldn't let his death be meaningless. She promised she'd fight. For as long as it took. Until AIDS wasn't a death sentence anymore. Until people stopped dying alone and afraid. Until things changed. Rock smiled, squeezed her hand back, and closed his eyes. Elizabeth stayed in Paris for 3 days. She slept in a chair next to Rock's bed, held his hand, talked to him, reminded him he wasn't alone. And she made plans. Because Elizabeth knew Rock was right. His death could change things. But only if they did this right. Elizabeth called her publicist. Told them what was coming. Told them to prepare. She called Dr. Michael Gottlieb in Los Angeles, the doctor who'd identified the first AIDS cases in 1981, asked him what resources existed, what organizations were fighting. The answer was devastating. Almost nothing. There was no major AIDS research funding, no government support, a few small grassroots organizations run by activists and volunteers. That's it. Elizabeth hung up the phone and knew what she had to do. 3 months later, Rock Hudson died. But here's what nobody knew about Rock's death. Before Rock died, he did something else. Something even braver than coming out. He held a press conference. Well, his publicist did. Rock was too sick by then. Too weak to speak. July 25, 1985. Rock Hudson's publicist, Dale Olson, stood in front of cameras and read a prepared statement. For words that changed everything. Rock Hudson has AIDS. The news exploded. Every newspaper. Every TV station, every radio show, every magazine. Rock Hudson, the movie star, the icon, the symbol of American masculinity, had AIDS. For most Americans, this was the first time they'd heard the word AIDS spoken on mainstream news. The disease had been killing people for 4 years. Over 12,000 people had died, but most Americans had no idea it existed, because the victims were mostly gay men. And in 1985, America didn't talk about gay men, didn't acknowledge them, didn't care if they lived or died. But Rock Hudson wasn't just any gay man. He was America's sweetheart. The man women had swooned over for 30 years. Suddenly, AIDS wasn't just a disease affecting people America didn't care about. It was affecting Rock Hudson, someone they loved. The panic was immediate. News anchors warned viewers not to shake hands with anyone who might be infected. Schools sent letters home telling parents to keep their children away from anyone rumored to be gay. Restaurants fired employees. Landlords evicted tenants. Churches turned people away. The fear was irrational. Doctors had already explained that AIDS couldn't be transmitted through casual contact. But people didn't care about facts. They cared about fear. And beneath the fear was something uglier. Judgment. Some people said Rock deserved to die. That AIDS was God's punishment for homosexuality. That he'd brought this on himself. Pat Buchanan, who would later run for president, wrote that AIDS was nature's revenge on gay men. Jerry Falwell, a famous televangelist, said AIDS was God's judgment on America for tolerating homosexuality. Even some doctors refused to treat AIDS patients. Said they deserved what they got. Elizabeth Taylor watched it all from Rock's bedside in Los Angeles. Because Rock had come home to die. He'd left Paris in late July, flown back to LA on a private jet because he was too sick to fly commercial. The press was waiting when he landed. Hundreds of photographers with long lenses trying to get pictures of the dying star. Rock's publicist had to issue a statement begging them to leave him alone. Let him die in peace. They didn't listen. Photographers camped outside Rock's house on Beverly Crest Drive, climbed trees to get shots through windows, followed his nurses, bribed his staff. Elizabeth snuck in through the back entrance, wore a disguise, brought flowers, and she sat with Rock for hours, days, weeks. They talked about old movies, old friends, old memories. Rock told Elizabeth stories she'd never heard, about growing up poor in Winnetka, Illinois, about his abusive stepfather, about joining the Navy at 18 to escape, about coming to Hollywood in 1946 with $8 and a dream, about his first boyfriend, a man named Jack. They'd been together for years, secretly, until Jack died of a heart attack in 1968. Rock had gone to Jack's funeral, stood in the back, couldn't even admit they'd known each other, because that's what it meant to be gay in Hollywood. You loved in secret, grieved in secret, died alone. Elizabeth listened, held his hand, and made a decision. When Rock died, Elizabeth wasn't going to let this be the end. She was going to make it the beginning of something bigger than both of them. Rock Hudson died on October 2, 1985, at 9 a.m. He was 59 years old. Elizabeth was there, holding his hand. Rock's last words were to his partner, Mark Christian. Rock told him to be brave, to live, to not let fear win. And then he was gone. Rock's funeral was private, small, just close friends. But what Elizabeth said that day would change millions of lives. Rock's funeral was held at a small church in Beverly Hills. Maybe 40 people attended. His family was there. His friends. The people who'd really known him. Elizabeth gave the eulogy. She stood at the podium in a simple black dress. No jewelry. No makeup. Just Elizabeth. And she talked about Rock. Not Rock Hudson the movie star. Rock the person. The friend. The man who'd lived 2 lives because the world wouldn't let him live one. She talked about his kindness. His humor. The way he'd send her flowers for no reason. The way he'd call just to make her laugh. She talked about watching him die. About holding his hand while he wasted away. About the indignity of it. The cruelty. And then Elizabeth talked about AIDS. She told everyone in that room that Rock's death couldn't be for nothing. That they had a responsibility to fight. To fight the disease. The stigma. The silence. The indifference. To fight until people stopped dying alone and afraid. Most people nodded. Wiped their tears. And went home. But Elizabeth didn't go home. 2 weeks after Rock's funeral, Elizabeth made a phone call that would define the rest of her life. She called Dr. Michael Gottlieb, the UCLA researcher who'd identified the first cases of AIDS in 1981. The man who'd been begging for funding for research for 4 years. Elizabeth asked Dr. Gottlieb a simple question: how much money do you need to find a cure? Dr. Gottlieb almost laughed, because the answer was staggering. Millions. Tens of millions. Maybe hundreds of millions. The government wasn't funding AIDS research. President Reagan still hadn't said the word AIDS publicly. Not even after Rock Hudson died. The National Institutes of Health had requested millions for AIDS research. Congress had approved a fraction of it. Meanwhile, people were dying by the thousands. Elizabeth told Dr. Gottlieb she'd get him the money. He asked how. Elizabeth said she'd raise it herself. And that's exactly what she did. In September 1985, Elizabeth Taylor did something nobody expected. She became a warrior. Elizabeth co-founded AMFAR, the American Foundation for AIDS Research. She didn't just lend her name. She became the face of it, the voice, the driving force. Elizabeth started organizing fundraisers. Big ones. She called every celebrity she knew, every wealthy person, every powerful person. She didn't ask politely. She demanded. She told them Rock had died. She told them thousands more were dying. She told them they had blood on their hands if they didn't help. And people listened. Because this was Elizabeth Taylor. You didn't say no to Elizabeth Taylor. At her first AMFAR fundraiser in Los Angeles, Elizabeth raised over $1 million in one night. $1 million. In 1985, that was an astronomical amount of money for AIDS research. More than the government had allocated for the entire year. At the second fundraiser, she raised $2 million. At the third, $5 million. Elizabeth was relentless. She organized galas, auctions, concerts. She convinced designers to donate clothes, jewelers to donate pieces, artists to donate work. She auctioned off her own jewelry, pieces worth millions. The Taylor Burton diamond, the one Richard had bought her for over $1 million in 1969, Elizabeth sold it. Put every penny into AIDS research. People asked if she regretted it. Elizabeth said she regretted ever having it while people were dying. She convinced other celebrities to get involved. Elton John, Madonna, Princess Diana. She testified before Congress. Looked senators in the eye and told them they were failing their constituents. Letting Americans die because they were afraid of political backlash. One senator told Elizabeth that AIDS research wasn't a priority. Elizabeth asked him how many people had to die before it became a priority. He didn't answer. But Elizabeth kept fighting. She met with President Reagan. Finally, in 1987, 2 years after Rock died, Reagan's own Surgeon General, C. Everett Koop, had been begging him to address AIDS publicly. The epidemic was out of control. Elizabeth sat in the Oval Office and told Reagan about Rock, about watching him die, about the thousands of others dying every month. Reagan promised to do better, to increase funding. He did. A little. Not enough, but more than before. Elizabeth met with George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, every president for the next 20 years. She became the most important voice in the fight against AIDS. But it came at a cost. Because here's what Elizabeth didn't expect, losing everything else. Elizabeth's Hollywood career basically ended after 1985. The offers stopped coming. Studios were terrified of being associated with AIDS. She was offered roles. Big ones. leading roles in major films. But they came with a condition: stop talking about AIDS. One studio executive told Elizabeth she could have the lead in a romantic comedy worth $10 million. But she had to step down from AMFAR, stop the fundraising, distance herself from the cause. Elizabeth told him to go to hell. She said saving lives was more important than making movies. He told her she was committing career suicide. Elizabeth said she didn't care. And she didn't. Her friends tried to intervene, told her she could do more good if she kept her career going, kept her platform, kept making money. But Elizabeth didn't see it that way. She'd made a promise to Rock, and she was keeping it, even when it cost her millions of dollars in lost income. Even when it cost her relationships with people who couldn't understand why she cared so much. Even when her own health started failing. Elizabeth had chronic pain. She'd injured her back decades ago filming National Velvet, had fallen off horses, hurt herself in stunts. By the 1980s, she'd had multiple back surgeries, hip replacements. She was in constant pain. She developed pneumonia, heart problems, spent weeks in hospitals. But she kept working, kept fundraising, kept fighting. In 1991, Elizabeth was hospitalized with pneumonia so severe doctors thought she might die. She was in the ICU for 6 days, hooked up to machines. And when she recovered enough to talk, the first thing she asked about was the next AMFAR event. Her doctors begged her to rest, to slow down, to take care of herself. Elizabeth said she'd rest when people stopped dying. In 1992, Elizabeth founded her own organization, the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation, separate from AMFAR, focused specifically on direct care for AIDS patients, paying for medications, housing, food, medical bills, helping the people who were falling through the cracks. By 2011, Elizabeth had raised over $100 million for AIDS research and care. She'd helped change public perception of AIDS from a shameful secret to a legitimate health crisis. She'd helped push for the development of antiretroviral drugs that turned AIDS from a death sentence into a manageable chronic condition. Millions of people are alive today because of the work Elizabeth Taylor did. And she did it all because of a phone call at 3 in the morning. A phone call from a friend who asked her to fight. March 23, 2011. Elizabeth Taylor died. And the world finally understood. Elizabeth died at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. Congestive heart failure. She was 79 years old. Her children were with her. Her friends. Her former husband's children. The people who loved her. And within hours, the tributes started pouring in. But they weren't just about her movies. Her beauty. Her 8 marriages. Her diamonds. They were about her activism. President Obama released a statement. He called Elizabeth Taylor a hero. A pioneer in the fight against AIDS. He said she'd saved countless lives. Changed the world. The head of AMFAR released a statement saying Elizabeth was irreplaceable. That the organization wouldn't exist without her. AIDS patients around the world posted photos of themselves online, holding signs that said, "Thank you, Elizabeth," because they knew the truth. Without Elizabeth Taylor, many of them would be dead. The medications they took every day, the ones that kept them alive, existed because Elizabeth had fought for funding, for research, for care. After Elizabeth died, her children went through her belongings. They found letters, thousands of them, from AIDS patients and their families. Letters thanking Elizabeth for visiting hospitals, for holding hands, for listening to stories. Letters from parents whose children had died of AIDS, thanking Elizabeth for making their deaths mean something, for fighting when everyone else had given up. Letters from people who'd been disowned by their families, fired from their jobs, abandoned by society. People who said Elizabeth was the only celebrity who treated them like human beings. Elizabeth had kept every single letter, organized them by year, read them when she felt tired, when she wanted to quit, and at the bottom of one box, her children found something else. A photograph. Old, faded, from 1985. Elizabeth and Rock Hudson, taken just 3 weeks before he died. They were sitting together on a couch in Rock's house. Rock looked terrible, skeletal, barely conscious. But Elizabeth had her arm around him, and both of them were smiling. On the back of the photo, Rock had written something in shaky handwriting. "Lizzie, thank you for fighting for me, for all of us. You're saving lives. I love you, Rock." And beneath it, Elizabeth had added one line. Years later, in different ink, I promised you I would never stop, and I never did. Until the end. Elizabeth Taylor kept that promise. For 26 years. Until the day she died. There was one more thing in Elizabeth's AIDS Foundation files. A letter she'd written in 2010. 1 year before she died. It was addressed to future AIDS activists. People who would continue the fight after she was gone. Her children debated whether to make it public. Finally, in 2012, they released it. The letter was 3 pages long. It talked about rock, about the early days of the epidemic, about the people she'd lost. But it ended with one paragraph that stunned everyone who read it. Elizabeth revealed something she'd never told anyone. A secret about why she'd fought so hard, why she'd given everything. And it changed everything people thought they knew about Elizabeth Taylor's final years.